To begin with, Adam and Eve in the garden being representative of spiritual man, oneness, illuminated, essentially a different order of being to our current state of duality or sin. Eve eats of the fruit first, followed by Adam, and they both unify with the serpent sexually. This bringing forth duality, consciousness becomes a fractal on two sides, the positive balance and the negative balance, Christ and Antichrist. The 369 or the yin, the yang, and the controlling force. From the yang comes the Christ balance, symbolic of the sons and the daughters of Adam. From the yin comes the Antichrist balance, symbolic of the sons and the daughters of the serpent, aka the Kenites. The serpent is a counterfeit god. The sexual union between Eve, followed by Adam, with the serpent, represents a polarity shift, whereby the male pole becomes the female and vice versa. So the positive balance becomes a negative balance. Now originally there was one symbolic triangle or 369. We had God at the top and Adam and Eve at the bottom, representing the masculine and feminine poles. So it's just the masculine and feminine consciousness, essentially. In this perfect state, the two poles were directly connected to God. Atonement, at one-ment, which is to say eating of the fruit of the tree of life. Both sides equally connected. Since Adam and Eve are representative of the masculine and the feminine aspects of our collective consciousness, in this example, and are referred to in Genesis as one flesh, they are best illustrated as two upwards triangles in the next fractal down, geometrically unfolding from the positive and the negative poles of the original triangle. The two new triangles are Adam and Eve in their spiritual bodies. They're upward pointing because their relationship with God is a positive polarity. They resonate below that which is above. Because they are one flesh, they are joined together as one, sharing their inner positive and negative poles respectively as one, forming another polarity, joint at the hip, so to speak. As you can see, we have gone from one small triangle to a larger triangle formed by the union of the two new additional triangles of Adam and Eve in their spiritual bodies, with the top triangle of God. However, by default, there is now another triangle between Adam and Eve, which is inverted. Just as you will be left with a negative if you cut a shape out of a certain material or substance, say a star, then you will be left with a hole in the material that is in the shape of a star, a negative image. Well, in this case, we have a negative inverted image of the top triangle of God. Therefore, the tip of the triangle of God is the tree of life, whereas the bottom negative image, or the inversion of God thereof, is the tree in the midst of the garden, aka the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the apple door to duality. So what is the identity of this negative inverted triangle in the midst or the middle of our larger triangle? Well, it's the serpent, aka the Baphomet. The serpent, which is, like I said, a counterfeit god, hence why it is smaller than God, represented by the complete triangle pointed upwards. Why? Because Adam and Eve are still at one with God in their spiritual bodies. So the top triangle, combined with the bottom two of Adam and Eve, are all one in the garden. Whereas the downward triangle in the middle is the serpent in the midst of the garden. Its snout, in this example, being the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Or more specifically, the forbidden fruit, aka the apple door. We already know of the fate that would befall Adam and Eve. They ate of the fruit, in what seems to have been a sexual union with the serpent. I mean, the jury may still be out on that one for many, but symbolically it makes sense, as I'll now show. What is a polarity shift? Well, it's when the male becomes the female and the female becomes the male. Okay, but Adam and Eve didn't switch sexes. They were the male and female polarity of what was overall a positive, aka male, polarity. It was the overall polarity that shifted, going from positive to negative. In other words, a negative image of the garden, its polar opposite, was created. This being where we are now, the world of duality. This is the garden in its original state. The negative or inverted version would look like this. The serpent has been elevated with the forbidden fruit now at the top. So the serpent is now pointing upwards, whereas Adam and Eve are now pointing downwards, literally fallen. They are now in physical bodies. The serpent has made them wise to the nature of duality. It has opened their eyes to the physical and closed their eyes to the spiritual. Only by going back through the apple door can they return, as would become humanity's burden to bear. So let's understand this step by step. At the top is God and his masculine and feminine aspects, the 9, 3 and the 6. Underneath is his negative image, the serpent or the devil. Image 2 shows God at the top and Adam and Eve at the bottom in their spiritual bodies, at one with God. And since all three are one, they make one large triangle. The serpent is in the middle. After the fall, a negative mirror image or an inversion of the Garden of Eden is created. So we have a hexagon with the forbidden fruit in its centre, between the garden and the world of duality. God still sits above both at the top. This helps to shed light on the good seed and the bad seed. The seed of Adam and the seed of the serpent, Cain and Abel. Although Cain killed Abel, so the two seed lines are in fact Cain and Seth. Cain's seed, the line of the serpent, the Kenites, are psychopathic in nature, evil. Their consciousness emanates from an entirely different source from that of the Adamic bloodline. First, let us discern the life source of the Adamic bloodline of Seth. The triangle of God sits atop all else. The two triangles of Adam and Eve, respectively combined with God's triangle, can also be thought of as a trinity. God, Adam and Eve is one way of looking at it. The Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost is another, which is man in its fully realised spiritual state, Adam Kadmon, unity with God via the higher self or the Holy Spirit. It is for this reason that all three should be considered one, and because they are one triangle. This triangle is the source from which Seth emanates, the good seed line. The serpent in the midst of the triangle offers its fruit in the very centre of the hexagon, the apple door from oneness into duality, situated in the abyss on the tree of life, known as Darth. God's essence travels from the great triangle through Darth and into our world on the right-hand path. This narrow path is the way of Seth, the good seed line. Next, Cain's source. In order to determine the source from which the Kenites emanate, we simply ask ourselves, who is Cain's father? Well, it's the serpent. Therefore, he comes from the negative downward pointing or inverted triangle. He too comes through the abyss, but unlike Seth, he doesn't leave the abyss. He and his seed line are vessels for a consciousness that has its home in the abyss. And it does not leave, cannot leave in fact, without those vessels. It is an inverted consciousness that can only receive. I'm talking of course about the Antichrist consciousness. Unfortunately, the Kenites are nothing more than vessels to be used by the Antichrist consciousness. That, it would appear, is what a psychopath is. They are merely the property of a collective hive mind. Any individual traits that they appear to have, their outward personality, is nothing but a smokescreen. They are an empty void. They're only to be manoeuvred around by the Antichrist consciousness. Soulless beings that do not exist, but pretend to. In truth, they are all one, as you know well by now. Now, Cain is number 7014 in the Hebrew Strong's Concordance. The word Cain, transliterated Cain, means possession. And that is exactly what the Kenites are. They are the possessed bloodlines. The way of Cain is from the inverted triangle out through Darth via the left-hand path. Cain's path enters Darth. It comes from and returns to the inverted triangle, but it cannot enter into God's great triangle. So this is the more symbolic interpretation of how the two seed lines came to be. The world of duality had to be created in order for the serpent to perpetuate its bloodline in a world of physicality. The duality of that world made manifest by the birth of good and evil through the womb of the mother of all, Eve. Understanding all of that, the inverted bottom half of the hexagram represents our fallen collective consciousness, divided by the duality of good and evil, and the reverence for knowledge, specifically the knowledge to return to Eden, which always seems somehow above us and beyond reach. Hence the triangle of the serpent being upright in our world, holding the apple door above us, like the false idol that it most certainly is. The Statue of Liberty demonstrates this principle rather succinctly, but of course, that liberty is the serpent's liberty. After all, those who venerate it consider it to be the liberator of mankind. Such people spend their lives attempting to get back into Eden, yet they revere the serpent who got us kicked out in the first place. Speaking out of one side of their mouth, they claim that Eden was a prison and the serpent freed us from that prison. But on the other side, they speak of illumination and returning. Quite the paradox, but easy to understand when you know that it is not the true Eden of God that they want to take us to. It is the false Eden, the abyss, oneness with their father, the devil. So, if the bottom half of the hexagon is our dualistic consciousness, perhaps one more triangle is appropriate to symbolize the primordial womb from which both the good and the evil came into being, the womb of Eve. It is both the womb and the world, which is appropriate, as a womb is synonymous with the term matrix. While it remains true that they emanate from different sources, they being Cain and Seth, as well as poor old Abel, they all came through the same womb. The enmity between the two seed lines continues unto this day. Also noteworthy is the fact that while the very first triangle of God alone had its negative image in the inverted triangle below, aka the serpent in that sense being akin to God's shadow, we find with the addition of the final triangle of the womb/world that the serpent sits upright above us, almost as if it is attempting to mimic God, lording it over us, holding the light that it stole from God. This crafty serpent is the God of this world. Those that serve it know and understand this well. It is this fact that presents us with our next problem, that being the presence of the serpent in the garden and the true nature of the Elohim. As is well known by many at this stage, Elohim is plural and it means gods, as opposed to one single god. Clearly, this group of beings, while certainly a higher order of being, no doubt with spirit bodies, cannot be the one true creative force of all that exists. They, like us, are imperfect beings. This must be the case because if it were not, how could evil possibly be present in the garden in the first place? The serpent in the garden, that anointed cherub, Satan, is proof positive that these Elohim beings were already in a dualistic state, some good and some evil, meaning Christ and Antichrist were already at war, and Satan, aka the Antichrist consciousness, initiated the fall of man in order to increase its numbers via the seed line and create more vessels for itself, as well as elevate itself to godhood and grow. The top triangle of God and its shadow illustrate the Elohim and their shadow being the serpent. Some of the Elohim must have at some point switched from Christ to Antichrist consciousness, and this reveals that Christ consciousness is not the end, it is the beginning. No one is infallible. However you look at it, the Antichrist was in the garden via its vessel, the serpent. This proves the dualistic nature of higher consciousness and flies in the face of the New Age notion that higher consciousness is beyond good and evil. Possession is very much a reality, and oneness with the Antichrist consciousness is exactly what possession is. The other side of higher consciousness that no one likes to talk about, and most like to dismiss. Knowing this, we must now account for the duality in the garden and acknowledge the presence of the Antichrist consciousness. The serpent is already represented by the downward pointing triangle, but it is the Antichrist consciousness, of which he was merely a vessel, that needs to be illustrated here, which is, as we know well by now, a negative polarity. Now, the two upward triangles already present are the Christ balance, or the Christ consciousness, which is a positive polarity. So the Antichrist consciousness on this model requires two new additional downward pointing triangles. The highest triangle, which sits above the serpent, is the tree of life by which this true creative spirit of the universe makes itself known. Its shadow is both the serpent and the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the midst of the garden. The possessed may not eat of the tree of life. Thus it sits above them and above the Christ balance, which is the yin and the yang, or the 3 and the 6, to the Christ's 9. Therefore, there are only two places to fit the negative polarity, one on either side of the positive Christ polarity. Note the significant fact that while the tree of life and its yin and yang poles form a triangle, whereby the tree sits at the top and its poles are at the bottom, the serpent and the Antichrist poles are all below it and on equal footing. This means that while the Antichrist consciousness had a presence in the garden, it was certainly not in any position of godhood. This is why it initiated the fall of man. By deceiving man to fall to a status below that of itself, the serpent has by default elevated itself to godhood, with a small g, of course. It sits upward now as the only source of light in a dark, inverted triangle. The negative polarity of Antichrist consciousness either side of it, and our world, the womb or the matrix, below it. Its light is in point of fact God's light, which it stole, as will soon be revealed, but in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Now, it eventually came to pass that Christ showed us all that you don't reach God via the false light of the serpent outside of ourselves. He showed us that the temple of God is within, that you are the temple of the one true God, the Father. What this means is that Christ consciousness has been with us all along, waiting to be received. Yeshua, who came through the line of Seth, showed us this. When you put Christ on the cross, symbolically speaking, meaning you put the chief cornerstone that the temple builders rejected on the unfinished pyramid, which is the temple, then you are reborn in Christ consciousness. The Xbox is, of course, the open portal. That is how you get back into Eden. Not by trusting the serpent who got us kicked out in the first place. The serpent, of course, has a counterfeit version of this process, which leads to possession. But that's what the serpent does. It copies and it distorts, because it has no light of its own to shine. Only the stolen light of God. Christ came and showed us what to do. He showed us that Christ is come in the flesh. Once again, meaning that we are the temple of God, and any who deny this are antichrists. But what is most important for the purpose of what I'm trying to get across is that God the Father has been with us all along. We were just too busy looking elsewhere to notice. Since Christ, meaning the positive polarity of Christ consciousness, has been with us all along in our fallen state, it must be accounted for on our model by the addition of two upwards pointing triangles, a positive polarity to counterbalance the negative polarity, Christ versus Antichrist. Satan had his minions in the garden, and the serpent was his vessel, Our world is an inversion of the garden, meaning God put his light in the inverted world for our salvation, just as Satan put his darkness in the garden to exalt himself above us. Since it is a direct inversion of Eden, we can see right away where our two upward pointing triangles belong. As can now be clearly seen, the full extent of the two trees is finally revealed. The triangle of light shines directly through the centre of the triangle of darkness in 3 directions, like a beacon. This is the light that the serpent tries to claim as its own. As can clearly be seen, this is a lie. The light is Christ's. And Christ is the true light bearer, from whom the serpent stole the title of Lucifer. We have the Catholic Church to blame for that obscenity. At this stage, we ought to be careful to understand this symbol, as many will try to argue that it could just as easily be perceived as the other way around, meaning it can be viewed as a black triangle of Satan shining its black light, its dead light, through the centre of Christ's triangle. It's really quite simple. Darkness does not shine, it draws inward only. Dead light is an illusion of the serpent. Darkness cannot sustain through light. When the light shines on it, it disappears. Those who would try to argue that good and evil are equal are barking up the wrong tree, the dark tree. The light that Satan claims to be his is that of Christ, and it shines through him because he is full of holes. The Antichrist consciousness can no more claim to be the light than a fence can claim to be the sun as a ray of light shines through its holes and cracks. That being said, the two triangles of Christ and Antichrist are still a duality construct, and one in that bipolar sense. God's nature is outside of duality as a whole, but the triangle within of Christ is God's manifestation within that construct for our salvation. Now I'll explain this further in just a while, but first we must observe the nature of the two trees in their full extent. Revealed here as the two triangles that are entangled as one 6-pointed star, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, once again revealed as one tree. They meet at the apple door, Darth, the glory in the centre, which is the portal from one side to the other. As I said, darkness does not shine, but symbolically we can certainly view the tree of knowledge of good and evil as the dark light shining in all its impossible splendour in the midst of the Garden of Eden. It would indeed be a captivating sight. To eat of it is to cross over, to go through the portal into the darkness of the black triangle. From that side, the tree would be the only light in the dark. It is not black light on that side, it is the true light shining through the portal from the Garden of Eden. The tree of life, God's light, which Satan tries to claim as his own. When Satan transmutated the light into darkness by causing the fall, by default, that which was dark in Eden became light in the inverted world, as is always the case with a negative image, and vice versa that which was light. He may be temporarily holding the forbidden fruit, the torch of illumination, but that is God's torch, and while he uses it to blind many, he cannot blind those who have eyes to see, and those who have eyes to see will use that light against him, just as he likes to use God's people against themselves. For it is that very light that also shines on him as he holds it high and reveals to us his true nature, an empty void that sucks inward. His use of God's light will come back and bite him on the arse. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You don't mess around with God. Now, I said a little while back that the duality construct of the two trees, which are in fact one tree, does contain God's essence in Christ consciousness, but that God is ultimately outside of that construct and only manifests within its boundaries for our salvation. So, where does God the Father fit into this picture? Well, God reveals himself as the circle encompassing the whole construct. The upwards triangle is his manifestation within the construct, but his true nature is the circle. When inside the hexagon, he is come in the flesh, and outside, he is the Father, the true all, which Satan claims to be, but cannot even come close to being. The hexagon is the free will boundary for God to walk, and the devil also, among us. Both can come in the flesh within the hexagon. Now, let us further explore the nature of the hexagram of duality, which is to say the tree of life, and of the knowledge of good and evil, both being as one. The tree of life is the only name necessary, since its shadow, the tree of knowledge, would not exist without it. You are not a manifestation of your shadow is a manifestation of you, and it cannot exist without the light. But neither could it exist if the light were everywhere. Thus, the hexagram allows it to exist by its dualistic nature. This has to be the case for consciousness to experience itself in a more limited environment, much like the Matrix films, a type of virtual environment, free will within a boundary. So the hexagram, as a whole, is the tree of life. It is the sum of all of its parts, and nothing less. We find, if we count the points of the hexagram, which is to say the fruits of the tree, that there are exactly 13 in all. 12 fruits around the 13 in the centre, which is a concept that we're all familiar with. That 13, of course, being Darth, Christ, and Antichrist, the sun and the black sun, the apple door of duality. Now picture this. Revelations chapter 22, verse 1. Quote,